and welcome to today's FIN Virtual Learning Series session. I'm Joshua Frame. I'm the National Chair of the Federal Youth Network, and happy to be joining you today from the unceded ancestral territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Algonquin Anishinaabe folks have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Very happy to be joining from this territory and for today's session on a heavy load, being an ally in the public service. We have four amazing speakers today. At the Federal Youth Network, we are committed to diversity and inclusion, both in terms of standalone events, but also in terms of being stewards of the GC panel pledge to ensure that people are included in events that not only touch on diversity and inclusion, but in career events, in all of our programming. And happy to see as well that we have a number of folks who are speakers today, who were also speakers yesterday at our in-person learning day in the National Capital Region. So with that, je vais mentionner que cette séance, ça va changer entre l'anglais et le français. So we will be switching between English and French. Our moderator for today will be Justin Ford, who is part of the Federal Youth Network team. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Justin. So Justin, all yours, and merci beaucoup tout le monde pour nous joindre aujourd'hui.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And like Josh said, welcome tout le monde. Welcome everybody. Bienvenue tout le monde. My name is Justin Ford. I am a team member of the Federal Youth Network. My pronouns are he, him, il. I am bilingual, so please, during today's session, you can ask your Q&A questions in either official language, and I'd be happy to support. Aujourd'hui, le séance c'est bilingue. Moi, je suis bilingue aussi. Alors, vous pouvez demander vos questions dans le cadre Q&A dans votre langue préférée. I would like to first introduce our opening speaker today, Abe Greenspoon. Abe is generously coming in to speak with us again today. He was also with us yesterday in our in-person learning in the NCR. And Abe's going to set the tone for today's discussion about being an ally in the federal public service. Abe, over to you.
Thanks, Justin. Merci. Bonjour à tous. Mon nom est Abe Greenspoon. Je suis directeur de la gestion des changements organisationnels à Immigration, Réfugiés et Citoyenneté Canada. Mes pronoms sont he, him, lui, il. Je vous parle aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple algonquin Anishinaabe. Indigenous people have inhabited and cared for these lands long before we gathered here today. I want to share my gratitude and respect for them and for the land and all that it provides us. As a public servant, I embrace the responsibility to help ensure that we as Canadians are respectful and grateful for the bounty of this land on which we all live, work, and play. To this end, I commit to continue to explore and make meaningful contributions to the calls to action that result from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Et j'encourage chacun d'entre vous ici aujourd'hui à faire de même, à reconnaître l'opportunité que vous êtes offerte de contribuer de manière significative à la décolonisation et d'agir. Et pour célébrer les contributions des peuples autochtones en soutenant de manière significative l'appunissement de la culture autochtone. I also want to wish you all a happy Black History Month. It's a time to celebrate our vibrant and diverse Black communities across Canada. Our country has a history of Black excellence for which we should all be thankful and celebrate. This month can be an opportunity to recognize and honor the many achievements and contributions of Black Canadian leaders. Comme Viola Desmond, qui a ouvert une entreprise pour former des femmes entrepreneurs noires et a été arrêtée pour s'être assise dans une section réservée aux Blancs d'un cinéma en scène de protestation en 1986. Comme Oscar Peterson, l'un des plus grands pianistes de jazz de tout le temps. Comme Jean Augustine, qui a été élu premier député noir en 1993. Comme Caroline Xavier, qui a été nommé premier sous-ministre noir de la fonction publique fédérale canadienne en 2020. Et pas plus tard que la semaine dernière, Shailene Curtis McAuliffe a été nommée le premier sous-ministre noir du ministère de la Justice. Please join me in celebrating these Black leaders who have each made our country better in their own ways. Not just on this day or this month, but all days and all months. Black History Month should remind us that we need to celebrate Black excellence all year. We should seek to lift up and elevate the voices of our Black brothers and sisters every chance that we get. And this brings me to a focus of my remarks about today's topic, allyship. To me, allyship is a lifelong commitment. C'est un voyage des apprentissages constants et d'apprentissage à nouveau pour reconnaître, élever, célébrer la beauté et la bonté de toutes nos relations. C'est une façon d'être qui vient d'un profond sentiment d'amour pour tout le monde et tout ce qui nous entoure, qui nous oblige à toujours rechercher activement l'équité, la justice et l'appartenance partout. To be a true ally is to be open to learning, growing, and improving over your whole life. There's no ally badge. There's no ally club where you earn ally points to achieve lifelong ally status. Being an ally is about allyship. It's a verb, not a noun. It's about constant and consistent effort to become a better person. It's about a process of trying, failing, learning, and improving. Et pourtant, malgré l'effort de toute une vie qui est nécessaire, être un allié n'est pas un fardeau, c'est un privilège. Être un allié signifie être quelqu'un qui se soucie des autres. Allié signifie amour et compassion. Et cet amour et cette compassion ne viennent pas facilement. Cela passe par des conversations inconfortables, des interventions maladroites et parfois même des punitions et des représailles. For those of us who are being asked to be allies, without having experienced the weight of discrimination, we need to recognize the further privileges we hold in this space. It's a privilege to learn about racism rather than experience it firsthand. It's a privilege to be able to acknowledge the history of colonialism rather than experience its enduring impact. It's a privilege to be here today to learn about how to be an ally rather than to have to ask for allyship. Today's event is a great sign. It's a great sign of the progress that we're making, and we still need allies to push even further, to step deeper into commitment in support of anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion, AREDI. Too many privileged folks are still sitting on the sidelines or minimally involved. I understand the fear that people have. There's fear that joining the AREDI movement will jeopardize those privileges. There's fear that the work is uncomfortable and has the potential to force people to make sacrifices they don't want to make. Maybe they can't truly see the benefits of inclusion, and in fact, mostly see the detriments. And even for many that see the potential social good, they prioritize their own benefits over the potential social benefits. J'ai l'impression que nous avons perdu de vue la valeur de bien social. Le capitalisme, le colonialisme et le racisme nous ont tous appris que certaines personnes sont intrinsèquement meilleures que d'autres et que certaines personnes méritent une vie meilleure que d'autres. Many allies who come from privilege will go to meetings, they'll wear the buttons, they'll post on Twitter and Facebook, and then they'll easily step back into their privilege when it suits them. Actively being an ally should mean doing things that hurt, that are painful, that are awkward, and that have the short-term impact of actually making our lives harder. Real allyship is hard work. If it isn't, you're not doing enough. And despite all this, my message for you is this: it's worth it. Cela en vaut la peine si vous vous souciez des humains et croyez que toutes nos vies ont la même valeur et que notre épanouissement commun est important. Cela en vaut la peine. Car pourquoi d'autres sommes-nous ici? Ce n'est pour démontrer notre amour les uns pour les autres à travers une lutte commune. And the truth is, when you embrace allyship, you will embrace the hardship. You will see the difficulty as part of the process. You will see the privileged position you're in, and you will feel called to use that position to affect change. You'll feel compelled to recognize, elevate, and celebrate marginalized people in your community, at work, in all parts of your life. And trust me, each of you are ready to step into this space fully. You have the ability to be fully committed allies. There are simple, practical ways that you can demonstrate your allyship. One of my favorite sources of inspiration is a book called Better Allies by Karen Catlin. Highly recommend picking up this book if you're looking for a good place to start. Better Allies by Karen Catlin. You can also subscribe to Catlin's weekly newsletter and our website, betterallies.com. On her website, she delivers every week a newsletter to your inbox with 5 weekly practical recommendations for how to be a better ally. So go to betterallies.com. Highly encourage you. It's a great resource. But I want to highlight some of the material from Catlin's book. In her book, she describes 7 roles that people who hold positions of privilege can play to be active allies. First is the sponsor. Sponsors vocally support the work of colleagues from underrepresented groups, especially in situations that will help boost their colleagues' reputation. The champion. Les champions soutiennent également le travail de leurs collègues, mais le font dans les lieux très publics tels que des événements et des conférences. Third, the amplifier. Amplifiers work to ensure that marginalized voices are heard by validating their ideas or removing barriers to their participation. Le défenseur. Les défenseurs utilisent leur pouvoir et leur influence pour amener des pairs marginalisés dans des cercles exclusifs tels que les tables des prix de décision. Fifth, the scholar. Scholars seek to learn about colleagues. They read books, they read articles, and they learn about the challenges and prejudices that their colleagues face. Les confidents. Les confidents créent des espaces sûrs pour que les membres des groupes marginalisés puissent exprimer leurs peurs, leurs frustrations, et leurs besoins. And lastly, the upstander. Upstanders are the opposite of bystanders. They see wrongdoing and they act to combat it. They push back on offensive comments or jokes. I encourage you to take a look at these 7 roles that you can play potentially in your organization for opportunities to think about how you can actively demonstrate allyship in your organization. There's never going to be a better moment than now for you to step into these roles and to make a difference. It's going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes. But please do not shy away from the challenge. Hesitating or retreating to your place of privilege is a decision that your racialized colleagues are not afforded. Show solidarity with marginalized groups by stepping into the space of allyship with bravery and commitment. Be ready for all the successes, failures, and opportunities to learn and to grow. You will make a difference. You will help us create a better world. L'Alliance est un voyage et j'espère pour beaucoup d'entre vous que votre voyage commence ou se poursuit à partir des conversations ici aujourd'hui. Merci d'être là et pour tous les efforts que vous faites pour être un meilleur allié. So I'll turn things back over to Justin to take it from here.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Abe. That was excellent. You really set the ground, and a lot of pieces you talked about is stuff I'd even had in my own notes to bring up with our panelists today. And moreover, better allies. So I know what I'm going to be reading this weekend. So thanks for we always look forward to tips of great places to learn, because like you said, it's about that, right? And it is about actively learning and forever growing. And we make mistakes, but we learn from them and we go. So Abe, thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here with us today. Thank you again yesterday for your presence at our in-person learning day. And I think at this point, I would love to invite our distinguished panelists to turn on their cameras, and we'll make the short introductions and get to today's session. But before we get too deep into it, I do want to recognize that this conversation we're going to have today might be hard for some folks. And it might bring up things that you've experienced in your own lived lives. And that, don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to ask for support. There is obviously the EAP program, which you could find on your departmental website. But we also have here in the chat a link to a document that outlines maybe across the nation more culturally specific, culturally sensitive help. So this was a list put together by the Black Executive Network, Chris helped us out today by sending it to us. Thank you, Chris, for this. This is something I think a lot of people have been looking for. It was published in the newsletter by Benren, and I suggest, if needed, please take the time. Walk away. Make sure that you're okay, because as Dr. Holly once said to me, self-care is one of the cornerstones, one of the important pieces in this work. So please take the time as needed and reach out for support. That said, I would like to introduce our three distinguished panelists today. With me, I have Dr. Holly. Dr. Holly and I have had many chances to work together, and I always look forward to working with him. And thank you for being here, Dr. Holly. We've got Deepika here, who it's our first time together, and I'm really excited to be sharing this, space with you. And thank you for having me here. And lastly, we have Chris Scipio, who also was helping us out yesterday in our in-person learning. So maybe Dr. Holly, followed by Deepika, followed by Chris. Take 2 seconds to let the folks know what you're doing, where you're coming from, and what brings you here today.
Laura, Justin, Laliak, to everyone here to joining us today. Merci et bienvenue. My name is Dr. Holly Ellingwood. Please call me Hall or Holly. My pronouns are he, him. Mes pronoms sont il et lui. I'm a person who's a 2 SLVQIA plus member of the public service. I also am a person with a disability, visible. I also have mixed heritage in my past and a lot of other things going on, and that's some of the intersectional identities. Here's some of the other identities that I think it's important to disclose so that you recognize some of the things that I'll be talking to and the point of view I'll be speaking with you today. This is my last day at Natural Resources Canada in the role of Departmental Policy Strategist for the Office of IDEA, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. My former role was with the Diversity Inclusion Secretariat, which I led at Public Safety Canada. A lot of work previous to that in all sorts of areas with the RCMP, justice, public safety in areas of United Nations, Canadian delegation, and combating organized crime, areas of research on things like the opioid crisis, cannabis legalization, sex work, the right to die legislation, the Carter decision from the Supreme Court. Also do volunteer work in specific areas, such as the Ottawa Hospital, and research patient and family care for diverse members and marginalized and vulnerable communities. I'm also a member of the Accessibility Advisory Committee for the City of Ottawa, which is also a volunteer position, and the founder of Fierté Orléans, which is c'est un espace pour l'inclusion pour les personnes de LGBTQ. Please. Et puis, the role I'll be doing starting Monday will be over at Immigration Canada as Deputy Director of the Anti-Racism Task Force. So if you have trouble getting a hold of me because the Natural Resources email stops working, the immigration one should be up and running hopefully in a couple of weeks with you today. My background before I joined the public service was in frontline work. I used to work in law enforcement and corrections. That was actually my first background, was in correctional work. I worked in areas of counseling, emergency, hospital work, also in residential treatment as a counselor and therapist. And then disability happened. And then I had to go to a desk job, which was an interesting transition to be sure. And since then have been doing work in both research and programs and in policy for about 8+ years now with the public service. Merci.
Thank you so much, Hall. That's congratulations on your move. I know NRCan will miss you dearly. I know the work you've done there has been incredibly impactful, but I look forward to see next steps. And on a selfish note, my partner works at IRCC, so I am excited to have those connections be made. Next, we'll move on to Deepika. Over to you.
Hey, Justin. Hi, Chris. Hi, Ollie. Hi, Abe. And hi to everybody out there. I'm Deepika, and my feet are on the ground of unceded Algonquin territory in a place that has historically been known as Ottawa, but is now also known as Ottawa or the National Capital Region. I've been in the public service for 15 years. Most of my time has been spent either focused on equity issues or public sector innovation. And sometimes when I'm lucky, I get to do both. Right now is one of those lucky periods. I am also a free agent with Canada's Free Agent Program, and I'm on assignment at the Department of Finance as their senior strategist on anti-racism. I'm a member of the Sikh community in Canada and also founder of the Sikh Public Service Professionals Network. Connect with me if you want to join. In my community, I also proactively challenge systemic racism and have been building my anti-racism practices for 2 decades now. I'm really glad to be able to lever them more fully in the federal public sector context. It hasn't always been the case in my 15 years here. I really want to actually take a moment to do 2 things, if you'll permit me, Justin, as part of my introduction, and just really recognize that as a system, as an enterprise, we are talking about systemic racism in a way that we haven't really ever before. And, 4 or 5 years ago, most of us, it wasn't even on our radar. So this is a huge shift and a huge opening, and I'm really pleased to see so many actors in this space having really mature conversations. And I wanted to congratulate everyone in particular who were involved in last week's FYN conversation, which is the first dialogue in this series of dialogues that we're now in. I think this is the second conversation. So it was actually one of the most anti-racist dialogues I've heard in my 15 years in the public service. It was a gift. It stretched my practice and my understanding of anti-racism. And I plan to turn back to it again and again to support my continued growth. And though I hold serious feels, really love everybody on this panel, I think it'll be really hard for us to match the caliber of last week's conversation, but I'm sure that we're all up for trying. And by segue, I wanted to start by taking a moment to link last week's conversation to this week's conversation, because I think that that's important. And I want to say that truth, hard truth, makes us uncomfortable, but it's part and parcel, and maybe even the most important element of anti-racism journeys. Last week's conversation was filled with the gift of hard truths, and it actually is the perfect shadow in which to have this week's conversation about allyship, because anti-racism at its most fundamental is a polarity, is a really simple polarity, a relationship between truth seeking and truth speaking. And we need to be rooted. We know that when it comes to systemic racism, truth can be hard, it can be painful, it can be uncomfortable. We are constantly told to sit with discomfort. But in order to do that, we need to be rooted in verbs like believe and trust and care for both truth seekers and truth speakers. So, and we know that that happens in the face of people's negative reactions to truth all across the system, right? Or their resistance to truth. And I guess I just wanted to say, like, the hard truths people share usually come at a great cost to themselves. They did the emotional labor of deep self-reflection. They're taking the risk of sharing. It can only contribute to the required changes if there's a network of solidarity around truth speakers rather than a cone of silence. I loved what I heard last week, as hard as parts of it were to hear, and my respect for all those involved in making it happen. That was a real show of solidarity.
Thank you, Deepika. And I do think today we have an opportunity to do great things. And this is the second session. We have 2 more coming up, folks, next week and the week after, which you can also find on our GC Wiki page. And I know next week I'm going to be having a discussion with Dr. Nadia Ferrer about cultural humility. And I'm very much looking forward to that one as well, and honored to be able to have that discussion with such, like here, esteemed colleagues and fellow warriors, if you will. Lastly, I'll pass it over to you, Chris, before we jump into some of the questions. Give a little quick introduction, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and good afternoon to everyone and the 345 participants that we have. I'm Christopher Scipio. My pronouns are he, him, il, Louis. I am also here based in Ottawa, traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe. As a person of African descent, I also want to offer land recognition in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. In the efforts and deliberate intentions towards decolonization, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that was never meant to be owned. We recognize that most of the land that was entrusted to Indigenous people was in some cases shared by choice, but all too often taken by force. I believe, as we're talking about allyship between Indigenous communities and Black communities are essential. These are two groups who have, colonialism has tried to wipe us away. There's the genocide here, there's a genocide in the African continent, but yet Indigenous people and Black people are still here. We still stand strong, we still persevere. So I want to extend my solidarity and my love to Indigenous peoples. Today is Valentine's Day, and I think allyship has a part of it. It's that love plug, I can't see it, but the Bell Hooks book, all about love. Anyone who knows me knows that I approach this work with a deep sense of love for my fellow public servants, love for the work that we do. And when you love someone, you want to see them flourish. You want to see them have the opportunities to bring their full selves to what they're doing, to not have to dim their light. And I think as we talk about allyship and the role of allies in using their social capital to make things a little bit easier, it's something that we should, those things we'll talk about. In my day job, I'm the Deputy Director for the Black Executive Network. The Black Executive Network was formed in 2020 to support Black executives across the federal public service. So from as a director, all the way up to deputy minister level. We work where we can with the Government of Canada to address issues of systemic and anti-Black racism. And the vision of BENREN is a public service that has equitable representation at all levels, recognizes talent, and leverages it to better serve all Canadians, because anti-Black racism not only harms Black public servants, but it harms Canada. And we need to deliver policy excellence, we need to have a public service where no talent is left behind, and allyship can help with that. One last thing that I do want to say before turning to you in the questions is that I believe that people get the label of ally way too easy. Just because you are not from a marginalized or an excluded group doesn't necessarily mean you're an ally, right? So I know, very often that you'll be in meetings and be like, oh, allies stand with your Indigenous and Black colleagues. And it's like, oh, half of you ain't really allies, and that's the truth. And we got to acknowledge that, right? And I think if we throw around the title of ally too easily and too freely, it devalues it, because as Abe mentioned in the opening remarks, there's a lot of work involved in allyship. There's a cost, there's social capital that you're using. You have to give something up, but you also gain a lot. But like it's action oriented. I think it's important that we always come back to that. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to participate in this conversation. So over to you, Justin. Actually, just
that was
you.
me.
Yeah,
I'll put a token in the jar. That last comment you made reminded me of a conversation I had with Patricia Harewood, and I know some of you know who Patricia is, a few years back, and Patricia actually saying that she herself wasn't very comfortable with the term allyship or being an ally, and that she was moving towards more of a co-conspirator, right? Sort of putting that onus on the individual to put themselves in that same place, and that if things don't go well, they don't go well for all. And that's, and if they do go well, they go well for all. But that co-conspiratorship, and I think both you touched on it and Abe was kind of touching on that earlier today, and maybe that's something we can sort of dive into going forward. But I would like to open up the official sort of conversation between us with this first question. And I think, Chris, given that we're actually kind of going back and forth on this, maybe I'll put this one towards you, but if you can, let people understand what your sort of understanding of allyship is and how it relates to your personal and professional experiences, right? Because like you said, it's not so much saying, can the allies all please stand up and come support, but there's also allyship amongst marginalized communities. And you're showing that right now. You clearly stated that you are an ally to the Indigenous peoples of this country. So allyship doesn't need to be embodied in sort of a, for lack of better terms, white savior cloak, but that it's multifaceted. So if you could take 2 minutes and maybe give us, sort of describe your understanding, and I'm super excited to hear what you have to say.
I will try to live up to that. And full disclosure, I do not have any prepared talking remarks, so I'm going to speak from the head, from the heart, from the soul. So yeah, we definitely do not need any more white saviors. Like, first and foremost, let me put it out there. We do not need saviors. What we need, and I think, the idea of co-conspirator is realizing that if someone is not able to flourish, that has an impact on everybody else, right? So as a co-conspirator, you're in it with the other person. I believe allyship is with people, not for people, right? I cannot say that I'm an ally unless I'm engaging with the community that I'm trying to support. And as an ally, it is for me to listen and amplify what they are saying. It's not for me to take center stage and to say this is what we should do, but it's to go back to the communities and say, you know what? I'm in this space. I have this opportunity. What would you like me to say? What would you like me to do? How can I take space so that I can make space, right? And there's that part. For myself in my work, previously to joining the Black Executive Network, I was a senior GBA Plus advisor at National Defense. A lot of that work dealt with trying to address barriers to gender inclusion. So, take a keen interest in trying to use my influence to help women. In particular, right now, with Ben Rent, a lot of that's to help Black women, partially because I see very often in meetings, Black women exhibiting the qualities that would be praised if it was in a white woman or in a white man, or even in a Black man, but it's held against them. If they speak up, if they challenge something, instead of being saying, oh, that's being creative and showing new ideas, they're labeled as troublemakers or hard to work with, right? And I think that is something that we need to push back against. Another way that I show my allyship is through my use of social media. So if anybody's followed me on Twitter at CPOCK, you would see that a lot of my tweets call people out and I speak very clear about what's happening. But secret here that I'll share with everybody is that oftentimes the things that I'm speaking about are not things that I've experienced directly, but rather people who do not feel as safe as I do, or they do not have some of the privilege that I have. They share these stories with me. And I use my space to speak on it, so to raise awareness. So again, trying to use what I have to do that. And that comes with a cost, right? I have been told many times that I will be blacklisted, that I am committing career sabotage. But for me as an ally, actually more so as a good ancestor, it's that I want to know that I'm using my voice for good. And, I often quote Audre Lorde, and to paraphrase, we are scared when we speak that our voices won't be heard. But if we are silent, we are still scared. So it is better to speak. So I think allies have a responsibility to speak up, knowing that there are other people who want to say these things, but are not able to because of the harms or the barriers that they face. And if you don't face those barriers, you have to use that power to make change. So to sum it up, allyship is active. It's constantly going back to the communities to get their to get your ideas validated and get confirmation from them. And it also involves you willing to take risks, because these risks are worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I definitely, I can't agree more. It's taking what you have available to you. We all have different skill sets. We all have different toolkits, but what do you have in yours that can help this work? And I think for me, you know, trying to navigate, like you said, my own career, my own experience as a white cisgendered man, the work I'm trying to do, and how do I do that best? And I really think I want to highlight at least one point in that last piece you said, which is go back, because you're right. I can't take license to say this is what's happening. So I need to go and talk to the Chris's and the Hollies and the Deepikas to say, you know, this is what I'm thinking. Can I get some, you know, like, can we co-conspire on this together? But I definitely hear you about, you know, not just sort of going blindly into the battle and thinking that because your intentions are honest and true that you're actually getting the mark, right? There's about that communication aspect. Get involved, learn, take advantage of the resources out there. Between Abe saying, hey folks, go read this book, Better Allies, to, you know, joining sessions just like this to hear and learn, make it your initiative to educate yourself. But again, communicate with the communities that you're, you know, co-conspiring with. So I mean, I think that really brings us to a great point. But first, I'm going to give it over to Deepika, who raised their hand and might have something to add to this.
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much. Already the start of a great conversation. I worry that allyship can be abstracted to mean anything right now. It's really become buzzwordified, right? And we know that it can be performative. We see that all the time. And I think that that's a starting point for allyship, but it can't be the middle of the story or the end of the story. So I feel like when we start to deal with that performative allyship or the cookies and the badges, et cetera, I think we're just stuck in the start of the story, and there's a clear resistance to move ahead in the story. And so we know that there are brands and influencers who engage in ally washing. As a racialized person, like to answer the question, as a racialized person, I've learned a lot about allyship recently when I'm experiencing it from non-racialized folks who have an active equity literacy and anti-racism practices, and who are unlearning white supremacy in an active kind of way. They are out there and they are fairly rare. But when you come across one and when you get to work with one, it's glorious, and they deserve a shout out because it's hard work. And there's always room to jump on that train. But I've learned the most from when I watch racialized people ally me or ally each other. And when I need to be concrete about it, I like the term solidarity. So I try not to talk about allies. I really appreciate it. It's a very old-fashioned term, but I really find value in that term and comfort actually in that term. But when I need to be concrete about allyship, I tell people that allyship it's a verb for sure, but it's a sensuous, visceral verb. So it's not just about listening. It's about listening with your entire being. It's about really being present with somebody and being open to witnessing a situation. It's not just speaking, it's speaking in ways that transcend ego. Again, after listening with your entire being. I'm also learning through active allyship, like through the actions of being in solidarity, about mutuality and reciprocity amongst and between people who are differently racialized or experience different forms of racism, and between Indigenous people as well. So there, I will say again, it's a conversation between people who are denied equity, or between people who have these historical and ongoing kind of experiences of underrepresentation, where It's about learning that it's not transactional. It's about learning that it's built on relationships that are generative. And again, like Chris said, grounded in care and love. So that's kind of how I know what allyship is when I'm experiencing it.
That's profound. I'm going to jump to Dr. Hall next, but I know him and I have experienced this personally together when we were in a session, and as soon as everything closed down, tears were streaming down people's like faces, because it was so profound and hit there. And I like that idea that it's almost beyond an intellectual practice, right? We need to bring the humanity back into it, and the heart has to be there just as much. And it needs to be an emotional roller coaster, if you will. Like I'm experiencing that right now live, you know, so much introspective and saying, looking in on myself and saying, okay, like what am I trying to, like you talked about dismantling, right? But to dismantle, you have to know it exists. So that process, you know, is a deep and personal process. And I think, like Chris said earlier, you know, I'm in a place of enough privilege that I can shut that off. Once it gets hard, I could turn that off, because I can go navigate the world with the privilege I've been given, and to constantly remind myself not to, and to don't turn that off, and face the darkness, and face the painful realities of knowing I've made so many mistakes in my life, unwittingly, you know, with no harm intended, but they were still mistakes and they were still missteps, and to learn from that. And it's an ongoing process. Paul, I'm going to pass it over to you to bring in some final piece of this. I do have a couple more questions I want us to get through before going to the Q&A. Folks, si tu n'étais pas ici au début, tu peux mettre vos questions dans le bouton Q&A, et tu peux voter avec le thumbs up pour votre favori, et je vais les demander durant la période de questions et réponses dans quelques minutes. Please, folks, don't forget you can put your Q&A questions. I'm seeing them come in, and there are a lot. Upvote the ones you really want us to talk about. But before going there, Dr. Hall, do you have a couple of last pieces you want to put on this discussion?
Oui, merci.
Merci à vous.
Je vais essayer d'être bref, mais c'est difficile pour ces sujets comme ça. Ils sont tellement importants, et it's not something you can make simple and give, you know, short little snippets with and have it really be meaningful.
I know.
I, like Deepika, really struggle with anything that's a title. It really does not sit well with me when we're giving ourselves titles to things like champion, savior, allyship. They all sound very similar to me. And I don't like that. And I'm concerned with the way the term ally has been not only abstracted, but consumerized, commercialized. It's become a brand, and it has lost meaning. And like Chris said, and like Deepika said, it's about actions. It's a verb, not a noun. And that's so important. It's just so important. And really, I think a lot of it even comes, that concept of allyship, that is the more abstracted version, that is the more commercialized version, comes from the very same things that we're alluded to when we use the words champion and savior et tout ça. Parce que si on regarde les films, on regarde les histoires qui sont sur la télévision et tout ça. Always, and I think about this not only with the way how Black people are depicted, but Indigenous people with disabilities, transgender people, always as the victims or the villains. We're always a threat, or the person to be pitied and saved in charity by the people with all the privileges. And it made me think of something that I heard a while back where, and I should mention the doctorates in psychology, and we do far more what we observe than anything we are told. So really think about that. We do far more what we observe than anything we are told. When I sit with that and I think about how do I dismantle that, I think about not only how it impacts me and what I think I deserve or what I think I don't deserve. It also impacts me in what I think I can achieve as a person who's a certain intersectionality. It impacts me in what I think will be listened to, what value my voice has, right? So what does that then mean? And this is part of dismantling. What does that then mean for my Black colleagues, my Black friends, my Black family, right? Then it gets very, very layered in terms of what society is showing us. And then what are we replicating? What are we propagating in what we do or do not do because we feel uncomfortable? I think really when it comes down to dismantling anti-racism and let's talk about anti-Black racism specifically, it's really about realizing that discomfort, if we choose not to step into it, what are we choosing to be comfortable with? Right? It's really important to reflect on that. Mindfulness is one of the most important tools to be somebody to help stand with and to help do that dismantling. And it's not so much for me about how to be there and how to be present for Deepika or for Chris or for you. It's a lot of the heavy lifting is about me looking at my life and how I navigate and move through it, what I think about it, what my expectations are, what my assumptions are, and then taking it apart, taking the time to really take it apart and look at it, give it the hard look at those hard truths Deepika mentioned, right? And sort of go, wow, I've still got a long way to go. When it comes to this work, I can tell you very honestly, I fail more than I ever succeed because it is a game of very, very small gains to make those more lasting gains later on when it comes to systemic change, because that's what we're talking about, systemic change, right? The meaningful change, that takes a lot of work. And I'll give you an example just in this conversation, something I forgot about. Because I'm not used to it and we don't see it very much in it being done. For anybody low vision, let me please describe myself for you. So I'm a person with pale complexion, short silver hair. It's white on the top. It is dark on the sides and the back. I have glasses. I'm wearing a navy suit, a light blue shirt, a teal tie with orange geometric patterns in it, and an orange pocket square. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Hall, one thing I think you're just reiterating as well as everyone else is that idea of titles, like allyship, not being a noun, a verb. It's action. It's not about self-imposing or being handed the title. It's just what we do, and tying that to we do more of what we observe than what we are told, right? And I think, you know, I've been in discussions like this before, and it's the importance of that modeling behavior. And if you look within the federal public service, especially for new entrants to government who are learning to navigate their own personal convictions with often folks who are doing work that isn't directly related to the EDI, AR, you know, sphere, but still actively trying to do it, what that modeling behavior looks like from, let's say, you know, your supervisor or maybe a more seasoned colleague that, you know, you're learning to navigate the system with. And that, you know, we need to observe these behaviors. We need to observe the work and how it is done, rather than just being told, go self-reflect, take the time to learn, read a book, you know, that's all great. But I'm hearing from all of you, and Abe as well at the beginning, that words don't matter in that sense. Titles do not matter, whether you're calling yourself an ally, a co-conspirator, you know, in solidarity with, it's still fundamentally about what you are willing to do, how far you're willing to push yourself in an uncomfortable direction, in sometimes a painful direction. And, you know, if you're not willing to go there, what are you willing to put up? Like that really rang true with me, that idea of if you're not willing to go that distance and go to those scary places, what are you willing to put up with to allow yourself to feel that comfort? And I think that's a really great question. We would go over to you for one last piece on this, because I've got one question I definitely want to ask all of you all. One question I definitely want to ask.
Yeah, you know, So this is a response to one of the questions that you had laid out, but I don't think that we're going to get there. And I think it's really important because I find, oftentimes people will ask, how do I learn how to do this? And I find this a really funny question. And it goes to your point, right? Why in this particular situation, do we express such learned helplessness? And I think that goes to Holly's point as well about the observed nature. And another organizational psychologist called it the difference between enacted and espoused values, right? And then Holly just added a layer to that around what we observe. So I just kind of, when somebody asks me that question, how do you go about learning this? I kind of feel like asking back in a snarky kind of way. How did you learn anything else? Right? Like, we learn by learning, right? You know how to learn, so like, go out and do this. But I'll offer a deeper question because you kind of press that button for me. So I'm going to offer you a deeper question for personal reflection. Offer everyone a deeper question for personal reflection. Every day in our workplaces and in our society, we are surrounded by injustice. How did you learn to become so comfortable with injustice? When did you learn that? Where did you learn that? Go back to the very beginning. We know those injustices. They're cycling through the news. We hear about them everywhere. They're cycling through our feeds. We know that they exist. When did we become so comfortable with injustice? And then start with that beautiful, powerful question, which I grabbed from LinkedIn, by the way, it's not mine. But I do have a collection of beautiful, powerful questions, and use it as a way to explore your own beliefs and the limits to your beliefs. And then find more such beautiful, powerful questions and continue to explore yourself. That, is another way in to doing this work of solidarity building. Holly mentioned meditation, or mindfulness, I think was the exact word. He mentioned mindfulness, and I will also say it is about self-reflection and it is about inquiry, but it's about going to like the roots of yourself before you try and figure out the roots in society.
Thank you. Yep, I couldn't agree more. And I love that quote. I'm gonna hold that one near. How did I learn all this? Right. And I have a lot of answers I think I can give because I've been in these sessions. But when I'm really taking the time to be mindful, and Holly, you'll be happy to know I've been in the last couple of years really trying to actively, meditate and get into it. Started with mindfulness, and now I'm trying to expand it a little bit farther and see what it's bringing up. And I've faced some scary demons inside of me, and I think I'm I like to consider myself a good person and all that, but I have made some missteps. So that reflection is important. Paul, do you have a last piece to add to this?
Yeah, something that Deepika said and about learned helplessness. I have a new version of that. And it's not really a new version, but a new way of conceptualizing that somebody else had shared with me. Weaponized helplessness. Right? The way people go, well, how am I supposed to know I'm not Black? Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm not Black either. And yet I can see and recognize the racism in our day-to-day. I won't catch all of it. I'm not somebody who's perfect and all-knowing and can do all the dismantling in one day or 1 year or several. It's a lifetime journey, right? But when I think about those things, it's just how the way we deflect to avoid doing the things that cause us discomfort, which, from a neuropsychology standpoint, at risk of sounding all of a sudden very academic, is totally understandable. The brain doesn't want to do the work. The brain doesn't like it. The brain is a very efficient machine. It's efficient by being very guarded and conservative with its energy. It doesn't want to do anything new. It never wants to do anything new because that expends energy it doesn't want to expend. It might need it for something. Doesn't know what, but the brain thinks it'll need it for something, right? We have to be able to recognize that that's what's going on, and that the discomfort about how we might see and how we might stumble we're going to stumble. It's a guaranteed thing in this space. We're going to stumble because there's no way any person, any individual knows exactly the right way to navigate for somebody else's trauma, intergenerational trauma, for people who are Black and Indigenous specifically, and anybody's individual trauma of what they've experienced as a person in their lifetime personally, right? So we're going to get it wrong, and we don't know what they've gone through that day, that week, that month, that year, that decade. We're going to get it wrong. It's about trying, that practicing the compassion and the mindfulness to be aware of that and be opening to the stumble to getting it right. And that is so needed in our leadership, by the way, here in the government of Canada at large, because I've heard more than once, some people pull me aside and go, well, Holly, if you need to correct me, just do it after the meeting. And I'm like, no. And I don't want anyone correcting me after any meeting either. If I do it wrong, call me out there and now, please. Let me know, because it's important that people see that. You want to build trust? Show that you're willing to own your mistakes and get it right and course correct. Right. Otherwise, how can trust ever be built? How can healing ever happen? How can the system ever shift culturally speaking? Right? The internal cultures of our actual government spaces, if we're not willing to show that, because again, we do so much more what we observe than anything that we're told. Leadership really has to step into that space. Thanks.
Holly, I couldn't agree more with you. And please, everyone here, I mean, for the, Holly, you and I go back a while now, but I mean, that's exactly it. Please call me out. And you're answering one of the questions in the Q&A, which I think I'll jump to, but Nagma asked, how can leaders show allyship to their team? I mean, how great of an example is it? Is saying, I am willing to be called out for making a mistake in the moment, even if my team's there. And I mean, Holly, I would be so, there's no one else I'd rather have call me out than you either, because I also know you would approach calling me out with a level of sensitivity and understanding, but it doesn't mean you wouldn't be honest and truthful about where I erred and perhaps even how I could do better for next time, because you're right, we will forever stumble. Like Abe said at the beginning, this is a continual, lifelong commitment of growth, because every day something changes. Society will shift slightly and new things will start. And, it's all interconnected, right? It's all intersectional, truly. And so we will continue to need to go forward. But, I think it's when I make those mistakes where I learn the most. Personal story, just to give a quick example. The other day, I was downtown Ottawa and trying to get to, meet a few folks that I know. And me and my friend were at the corner and it was a red light and no cars. I was like, hey, let's just jaywalk. And my friend, who just happens to be a Black man, is going, nope, I'm not going to do that. And it stopped me right in my tracks. I was like, you're right. I do it. No one would think twice about it. Before my friend and my colleague, it was a no, and that was a mistake. And I felt it. And I addressed it right there. And I said, listen, I am sorry. It didn't even dawn on me, right? And that's it. I made a mistake. I won't do that again. But it was great that I was close enough with this individual that they could say to me, hey, Justin, have you taken a second to think that maybe for me, even something as silly as crossing here, no car in sight, is a behavior I have learned to adapt in my day-to-day because of the experience I have had for the X amount of years I have been on this planet. And that was, it's just a small example, but I think, folks, this is what we're doing. So on that, let's jump into some of the questions if you're okay with that. Is everyone good with that? Because I see some coming in and we have a super engaged audience right now. We have almost 20 questions already. So, pour tout le monde, vous pouvez demander vos questions en les deux langues officielles. Nous sommes ici pour les répondre. Tu peux mettre dans le Q&A et tu peux voter avec le thumbs up pour celui que tu veux demander le plus. Folks, don't forget, put your questions in the Q&A. Vote on the ones you really want to have asked, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. But I do know that for Chris, Deepika, and Hall, I think I can speak for us all when I'm saying this is just so engaging. It's just, I could do this all day. So thank you. So the first question we got here from an anonymous attendee was, how can allies effectively address and respond to the resistance and pushback from those who oppose efforts towards equity and justice? All right. So would somebody like to take that? I mean, there's a lot that could be, taken out of that one.
Sorry, could you just repeat that one more time?
Sure. How can allies effectively address and respond to resistance and pushback from those who oppose efforts towards equity and justice?
If I could start with that, and then
Chris, please.
Holly and Deepika, please add more brilliance to what I'll try to say. I mean, I think first and foremost, we need to focus on whose comfort and discomfort we are prioritizing, right? So I don't know how someone is opposed to equity and justice and is part of the public service, because our values and ethics, respect for democracy, justice is part of that. Respect for people means equity is part of that. So if you have a problem with equity and justice, then I really don't think you should be part of my public service. I'm just going to say that. Now, that may not be what you say in a meeting, but I want that person to know that's how I feel about them, because that's an issue right there. The second thing you do is you look at the data. So let's take a case in point. Within the federal public service, as of March 2021, we had 6,717 executives. We also have gender parity, because about 51% are women. But of that 6,717, 128, or less than 2%, are Black. Black people represent at least 4% of the federal public service and about 5% of the Canadian population. So the data right there shows a lack of representation. That's a fact, right? So that's what we're dealing with. Another stat, and this is work due to Dr. Martin Nicholas and Shamir Kanji at CRA that they're working on, this disproportionality index, right? So again, you pull the data across the public service, we're very privileged with these jobs. 23% of us will earn over $100,000 a year. For visible minorities or racialized communities, it's about 19% that will earn that. But for Black public servants, it is only 15.8%. The disparity of 7.5%. We talk about evidence-based policymaking. We embrace knowledge statistics. We embrace big data and analytics. Well, the data shows that there are groups that are suffering. So we have to address it. But an ally also needs to have an abundance mindset, because at no point when I am advocating for more Black people with disabilities to be hired in the 5,000 by 2025, am I saying do not hire Sikh people with disabilities, do not hire Jewish people with disabilities, do not hire white women with disabilities, right? So those of us who experience exclusion and marginalization, we've never said it's only about us, not about them. What we're saying is right now, it is my house that's on fire. So please help me out the fire in my house. And of course, if my neighbor's house was on fire, I would help them too. But right now, their house isn't burning, right? So I think we need to, when people push back, we have to call it out. We have to challenge them as to like what it is that they're opposed to and why. And then use the data to speak to what's going on, but then also remind them that, there's no hierarchy of oppression. And like just because we're helping one group doesn't mean we're not going to help the other group. It's just that this group needs more help now for specific reasons, and that's why there's a focus there. That's been my approach, but I'll let Deepika and Holly add to that.
Thanks, Chris. Deepika, Holly, do either of you have anything to add? If not, I know there's a ton of questions. So we'll go Dr. Hall first and then to Deepika.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So much appreciate your brilliance, Chris, and what you say and how you say it. And you're absolutely right. It's about, when it comes to oppression, I so much hear from people that zero-sum conceptualization of things. If this group gets that, then nobody else gets anything. And that can also cause a lot of infighting amongst our groups, right? Because we're all scrabbling for that one piece of pie. There is no pie. Get rid of the pie concept. We do have limited resources. It doesn't mean that rights are limited. It doesn't mean that the needs are limited. It doesn't mean that the means to address them are at the cost of others. It just can't be. When it comes to dealing with resistance and stuff, absolutely. If you're not for equity and social justice, what are you doing in the public service? Go, go. You know, this isn't what's going to work. It's not what's going to help make that cultural shift. From a psychological standpoint, something I will add in two different ways. One is that when we approach any relationship, it doesn't matter if it's at home, with family, if it's out on the street, if it's at the market, or if it's in the workspace, approaching it to have a win-lose outcome sets up all the people to fail. I say that in the sense that when you're setting up in a relationship for one group or person to lose and the other one to win, you're automatically setting it up for tension, contention, and strife instead of actually moving together. We won't be able to shift the culture without you. We can't do it without you. It can't happen. We have to all be trying to push in the right direction to get it moving in the right direction, right? It's not about winning or losing. It's about creating a better understanding, a deeper understanding about why these things are the way they are and why they need to move the way they need to move, why we need to be open to stumbling, why the stumbling will happen, why it's not about all our good intentions, it's about the impact of them. It's about the impact and harm that some of that causes, about all the harms that we don't see and don't know because we do not get impacted by that same thing, right? And recognize that we don't know all those things. We don't. There's no way, right? And so that's so, so important in all of that. And instead of a hierarchy and a competition about who's this, that, Young has written, and this was back, I think it was either the early 2000s or late 1990s, a really brilliant article about the 5 faces of oppression, which isn't about how one group is more oppressing, but looking at the ways oppression impacts us, almost as if you were looking at a series of symptoms of a disease that needs to be healed and treated, right? Get away from the competition. That's not us. That's a systemic harm, that concept of competition over it. It's not going to serve any of us well. And let's give a very immediate example of it right here in the National Capital Region, the area that's currently known as Ottawa, formerly referred to as Odawa, right? Where we have blackout on the 17th at the NEC happening, a really fantastic initiative done by the National Arts Centre so that people can have a night where it's all for the Black people during Black History Month to go experience Black theater together. The pushback that's happened of that reminds me strongly of the pushback I receive every year as a member to SLBQIA+. Not saying it's the same, saying it's similar, being clear here. When people tell me, well, there's no straight parade. There's no cisgender parade. There's no cisgender flag. Voyons.
Voyons.
Parce que ça, c'est vraiment où on est, where you have to justify and defend why we have a space specific to help celebrate a group that's been marginalized intergenerationally.
Oui. Mm-hmm.
What does it cost us? Nothing. And yet we fight and rise up against it. That is completely a knee-jerk reaction that's systemically taught to us, that we have to own and navigate around and change, right? And that's like, and those things, people make it like it's so hard. It's not. When you get used to it, it's like learning a new language, right? When you first start it, you're super self-conscious. You feel like you're getting it all wrong. You're stumbling all over the place. But after a while, you get more and more fluent, more and more comfortable. You start to recognize, you know, the verbs, the vocabulary, you grow, right? Growth. It's about continued growth. Those would be my 2 cents. Over to you, Deepika.
Sure, I'm going to keep it short because I want to get on to other questions as well and hear the brilliance from our participants who joined us. I will just say that, you know, actually just piggyback, because I could say 700 different things. My brain is exploding right now. But just piggybacking off what Holly has just said, the converse is true as well, right? There's the language, the learning, the observing that accompanies growing skill set, a toolkit around solidarity, there is also learning about how systemic racism and other forms of discrimination show up in our institutions. And I think that that playbook is just as important. And one day, when we all have more time, that might be something that we think about actually writing as well. There are, lots of people have done this, but for our specific environment, what have we learned? What have systems and institutions taught us about the ways they respond to change agency, and that they've actually asked us to undertake, and then the ways they are simultaneously resisting change in all sorts of ways. That in and of itself, like the system has requested this action or set of actions or this movement, and the system needs to actually ally. The other thing I will say is know your rights from the Constitution on down. Right to your collective agreement, know your rights, Multiculturalism Act, Charter of Rights and Freedom, just know your rights. That is a huge, or know our collective rights. That is also a huge way that we can become more literate in this process.
Oh, thank you so much. And yes, know your rights, between the Accessible Canada Act that's been passed, all of it. Any chance you're a Clash fan? Because that's also one of my favorite Joe Strummer songs, is Know Your Rights. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to jump to a question here, which actually kind of ties into the one question I didn't get to ask in our pre-planned questions, but I think is important to tie together. And we just got a question jump in, so I got to scroll all the way back up. Okay, so this question comes in that said, they've heard before from certain literature or media that it's not the job of marginalized groups to educate the allies, right? It's not their burden to carry to make sure folks like myself know the ins and outs. So but it is also leads to it being sometimes hard, especially for folks who are sort of taking their first baby steps, if you will, into this sphere, to learn certain experiences unless we go to the source or said group and learn from them, right? So I think the question really is, how do you navigate that, not putting the burden on the marginalized communities to make sure we know what we're doing? But I want to take it a step further and say, how can we also do this work without inadvertently even inflicting more harm on the groups? I don't want to harm people in doing the work I'm doing, but I know I can make mistakes. And sometimes asking people to relive and tell me about individual experiences they've had can actually do more harm than good, even though if I'm coming from that space. So I would like to pose this question, how can we take that burden off? But moreover, how can we ensure that when we are engaging in this work, that we're not inadvertently harming the individuals we're doing our best to support? Anyone want to take that one? I know it's a big one. And there's a bit of selfish in there. I'm like, help me learn and make sure, which I'm doing exactly what I'm saying maybe we shouldn't be doing, but I think it's a question a lot of folks wanted to hear. Deepika, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to, in a moment of allyship or an example of allyship, say that there are more accurate terms for marginalized when we're talking about just societies and injustice. And I think I prefer and think about using underserved in the work that I do, or equity denied, or institutionally underrepresented in historical and ongoing ways. So, I know that there are people who fit under the term of what's meant by marginalized, who might have other ways that they want to be identified, and I'm really open to hearing those as well. And that's really, I'm not an educator. beyond clarifying definitions, I'm not an educator, so I don't teach, and that's where I stand on doing that kind of labor. Period.
Thank you, Deepika. And as
Happy
somebody
to have
who is,
conversation with folks, but I won't.
and this is it. I've taken the notes, right? My list is going. I'm trying my best. I'm going to take these into them. But as somebody who is a trained educator, you've got the natural gift. So don't worry about that, right? You don't need a piece of paper from some institute to say that you
Oh,
are.
it's not a matter of incapacity. It's a matter of choice. I choose not to teach. That's not my role.
I gave it up as well for a reason. Hall, I see you. Would you like to take this one?
Oh, I'm trying to be diplomatic in what I say. I don't think any of us from any, I tend to use the term equity impacted, Deepika, a lot of the time. And I appreciate the terms underserved and underrepresented historically and systematically. And learning about my personal experiences, well, okay, in a certain context, having my experiences of how I've been discriminated against, marginalized, and met with, systemic violence in my life. How is that going to make you do this better, do this work better? It feels more exploitive about mine or anybody else's experiences, whereas there is so much out there now in this world of internet access, books, audio, blogs, vlogs, Spotify, etc. There is so much out there. The thing I would say to people is you can go to the source. There's a lot of things written by Black people about anti-Black racism work. There's a lot of blogs and stuff out there by Black people about being anti-racist. There's a lot of things you can access without in any way taxing and impacting your coworker, your friend, somebody at some convention. I have no idea. There's so many ways that we can access information that in no way will personally tax somebody else, because the work's already been done by other people who are doing it, who are choosing to do it, right? Because that's how they feel they can best move that needle in the direction of greater equity, greater representation. That would be my 2 cents.
And thank you, because I remember the day. I remember when this all started for me. From when it just went to my parents. Luckily, I have great parents, and they're both still with me, and I have them in my life daily, and they raised me as best they could to be a good and just person, right? And I grew up in a community where I had exposure and lots of friends, and I grew up in Montreal, right beside Côte-des-Neiges. And if anyone knows the demographics of Côte-des-Neiges, it is the most diverse community in all of North America, and they didn't shy away from that. But it was the day a professor of mine at Dawson handed me, and this one's for you, Chris, Killing Rage by Bell Hooks. And I read that, and it, like you're saying, it's out there already. There are examples that are tomes of the highest order that we have access to. And right at the beginning of this whole session, that's what Abe was saying. Take the time, educate yourself, go learn, read the books, whether it be the Better Allies that he mentioned. Chris, your Bell Hooks that you showed us all on screen is honestly one of my all-time top 5 greatest books I've ever read, and I've read it numerous times, and my copy's fallen apart with notes in the margin, and I reread it every couple of years and see how almost, it's an exercise in showing my development or where my ignorance might have been. Like some of the questions I wrote in there when I was in my 20s was like cringy, I'll be honest. It's cringy to reread them now at this station in my life. So Holly, thank you. It's out there and we can do that. For anyone, who's showing up to these, there's one question I need here is, what can we do to support and engage with marginalized communities? Again, using marginalized communities, but we can say underserved, equity impacted, underrepresented, equity denied. But how can we do as allies and support more than just showing up? Like, we're here and we're learning. So I would actively engage those watching today. Take these notes, take the names of the books, go get them on Amazon. They're easy. Go to your local library. Ottawa has some of the greatest libraries in the country. They're there. They're available to you. Please do it. So I guess on that one, I should ask you all, what can we do besides just showing up for events or discussions like this? I mean, while these are a good place to be and a good place to start for a lot, what more? Chris, maybe to you.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. And before I answer that, to the previous question, what I would say is, after someone has taken the time to read the books, to listen to the podcasts, if you want to have a conversation with me about what you read and learned, I am all for that, right? That means you took the time, and then we can have a dialogue, and you can say, Chris, which podcast do you listen to? Because I'm curious about that, right? But don't come with learned helplessness, because you use the internet to do your language training. You use the internet to learn how to do Excel spreadsheets. You did it how to write a briefing note. You can do it for this too, right? So I think when people come to these events, when people share their lived experiences or knowledge, you have a responsibility to do something afterwards with it. But what you do is dependent on where you are in work, your responsibilities, your job titles, right? So how you demonstrate allyship is very dependent on your space that you operate in, right? So, as a case in point, if we're talking here to the point that Holly mentioned of all the Black academics who've written many books about anti-racism, right? So if you're writing a briefing note and you came to this talk, when you write your briefing note, perhaps you don't quote Robin DiAngelo as the person to go read, but you instead say, hey, how about you read this book from Angela Davis? What about you read this from Audre Lorde, or to show me coach, right? Like this. How about you promote Black academics when you write your briefing note as subject matter experts, right? You're planning an event, and it's in April about infrastructure. How about you make sure you contact an Indigenous construction company, an Indigenous architecture to come talk, right? Don't only invite them in June for Indigenous Heritage Month. Invite them year long. Right? These are little things that you can do. But another thing that you can do, and shameless plug for the Black Executive Network right now, but if you're involved in staffing, right? And you're like, I don't know where to find talent. And I don't know how you don't know, but people still don't know, right? Mm-hmm. You can be intentional about your staffing. You can say, you know what? Look at my team. These are where the gaps are. I'm going to support one of the Black talent management initiatives that Benran has, right? Whether that is for Black executives or a future leaders initiative, right? And it's knowing that because you've heard about career stagnation that Black employees face, when you offer them the job, it won't be at level. You're going to realize that this person is more than qualified, and you're going to give them an acting opportunity, whether it's for a little bit of time or it comes in a term, but you're going to promote them because you can close the gaps, So I guess last week, Friday, the clerk, the prime minister on the advice of the clerk had a little DM shuffle. We now have 2 Black deputy ministers, and we now have the first Black man as an associate deputy minister. And that is amazing. But if the clerk thinks that's it, no. There is way more work to be done, right? So it's also ongoing work. So it's not just, okay, I came to this event and I did one thing and now I can go rest on my laurels. No, like this is a lifelong commitment to change and always being action oriented. So those are some of the things you can do. Thanks.
I'm going to pass to Deepika and Hall. If you could each give us one quick example of it. I am conscious of the time. We're coming up to the end. I want to just give a quick summary at the end, maybe in French, pour nos participants francophones. But over to both of you. Deepika first and then Hall last.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like so many of our conversations in the anti-racism space, by default and by nobody's fault, it just happens. It feels like we spend a lot of time speaking to the needs of non-racialized employees. So I want to say to racialized and other equity denied employees, ask for what you need, right? So the question is what other actions can we take? Ask for what you need. Figure out who's in your corner figure out who's in solidarity with you, and do it by asking for what you need. And let me know how it goes, because I'm curious. I've started to ask for what I need more and more, and it's going well. And I really encourage folks to give others the opportunity to show solidarity, to be an ally, and use those words and frame it. What I could really use right now is this: would you support me as an ally?
Yeah, my mother always taught me that growing up, and I'm not even coming from that perspective. Just be honest and truthful and ask for what you need. Because if you don't ask, and this is what we were saying earlier on, if you don't, it'll never come. And if you do and it's denied, you have more information, right? But if you do and it arrives and you get it, well, I mean, again, every single piece of Lego we put into this will just build it higher and higher for all, right? And I really heard that when you were saying it.
I'm not saying to accept crumbs. I'm not suggesting to ask for crumbs. That's not what I'm saying.
With Lego.
Ask for what you need.
Yep. And I couldn't agree more. Ask for what you need. Paul, over to you for one last piece of, wisdom. And thank you.
Oh, I'm gonna say something similar to what Deepika said, in the sense that my brain is like boom, boom, boom all over the place because of just so many things that are sparking because of what Chris has said and what Deepika has said. A couple of things based on the things when it comes to looking at those sources. Also, make sure about the sources, right? Let's talk about some of the racism and anti-Black racism specifically, and that we see in things like areas of the 2SLBQIA+ community. There's a history there of that. If you look at the history of Stonewall, right? Marsha P. Johnson. There's a lot of trans erasure and Black and color erasure that happens. And so if you're looking at a documentary or movie based off of Stonewall, for example, and you see one token gay Black man and nobody else, and nobody trans or gender diverse, know your, again, question. Look for, frankly, look for the whitewashing in these things. Look for the things where you're not seeing the representation, and then question the sources. The same thing for anything Indigenous. Speaking of that, right? Is it by somebody Indigenous? Make sure, right? And what you're looking at and reading at. And speaking of things of learning things online, there was a really great quote from a person named Weekend Warrior, who is an advocate on social media and TikTok. They deconstructed, I'll be paraphrasing only. They deconstructed a quote, and some of you have no doubt heard me say this before. And it's about the quote you hear about inclusion being inviting everybody at the table. Equity is looking at who's not at the table. And social justice is looking at whose voices at the table aren't being heard due to dominant discourses, power relationships, right? From a decolonial aspect, the question will be who built the table and what is the table's purpose? Now, if we really want to deconstruct this system that is anti-Black, that is anti-color, that is anti-gender diversity, that is anti-able diversity, that is anti-age, that is misogynistic, because it is all those things. The evidence, there's a lot of evidence out there, it's all those things and more. Then let's really do that deconstruction, dismantling of question who built the table, whatever it happens to be, whether it's our policy, our programs, our hiring practices, and figure out what do we really need, because maybe it's not even a table. Thank you.
Well, those are some profound words to end today's session on. So I want to take a quick moment to thank all of you for being here. Thank you for allowing me in this space to have this conversation with you. I know I'm walking away better for it. Merci à tout le monde qui nous avait joints aujourd'hui. Je pense les grosses idées, c'est jamais arrêter d'apprendre, faire les efforts qui sont vrais. Si c'est pas confortable, tu fais du bon travail, j'imagine. Si c'est trop confortable, tu dois travailler un peu plus fort. Et prendre le temps pour réflexion de soi et de vos pensées. I will then ask my fearless leader, Josh, to join in and say a few closing remarks. But again, Chris, Deepika Hall, thanks. Really, thank you so much for letting me be here. This is incredible.
Absolutely, Justin. Yeah, thank you to the three of you. This was incredible. It was great to hear your experiences and your insights. And I know I learned a lot from this session and have a lot of next steps in terms of resources and things to look into. And I'm sure that I saw throughout the session, throughout the Q&A, folks were really engaged. The recording of today's session will be posted on our FYN YouTube channel later this week. So if you have colleagues that you would like to share that with, we will be posting that very shortly. And coming up on February 21st is our next session in this series with Trudy Samuel and Nadia Ferreira, Dr. Nadia Ferreira. And then our final session will be on February 28th, hosted by Liz Martin, a frequent partner of ours, featuring IK Iro, who is the United Nations independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. So that both of those sessions, I think, will be excellent as well. So really looking forward to the next two. But thank you very much for your contributions today, for joining in with the Federal Youth Network audience, and sharing openly and honestly. And thank you, Justin, as well, for great moderation today. Alors, merci beaucoup tout le monde. Et c'est la fin de notre session, mais joignez-nous le 21 février pour la prochaine séance. So please join us on February 21st for the next session. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great day.